Welcome everybody. It is so lovely to see you all, especially during pretty much our final week of this semester. Much admiration for everybody showing up, and I think it says a lot about how much we're looking forward to your talk. So when it comes to the study of Asia, UVA seems to have a very robust South Asia focus and a pretty substantial East Asia program. And our comparatively smaller Nelson Southeast Asia Committee consists of a small, ever-changing, but very vibrant, I would say, collection of faculty and students that has been fortunate enough to have found a comfortable existence alongside and in relationship with its much larger East Asia counterpart. I think a great benefit of this coexistence and positive relationship is that we do not feel the need to frantically guard geographical or other boundaries demarcating our respective areas of focus and expertise. Instead, what makes up East or Southeast Asia can be approached with some flexibility and mostly with some generosity, also sometimes in response to thematic desires and also geopolitical changes. Over the past year, we've had a few conversations amongst ourselves about the potential inclusion of Taiwan within the purview of the Nelson Southeast Asia Speaker Series. And these conversations are not unique to UVA. They are occurring in many US universities and also across the world, as I found out this past year, including at Brown University, which is where today's speaker hails from. It is with the greatest pleasure that I introduce all of you to Dr. Rebecca, and now I'm going to mangle your last name. How should I pronounce your last name?
Nedostup.
Nedostup, thank you. Dr. Rebecca Nedostup, who is an associate professor in both the History Department and the East Asian Studies Department at Brown University. And her talk, to an extent, will touch upon exactly these issues that I just mentioned. For example, when she examines the links among several aspects of Taiwan's modern history that resonate with Southeast Asian experiences and research methodologies, with space, place, and belonging, with property rights and preservation, and transitional justice. To give you a little bit more background on today's speaker, in her research, Dr. Nedostup is interested in the social and cultural impact of modern Chinese political movements, migration within and across borders, and the development of communities amid displacement, mobilization and demobilization, and the changing conception and treatment of the dead in the modern era. The topics of the migration of governmental and legal regimes and practices across various state formations in modern China and in Taiwan are the main currents propelling much of her research. In her earlier work, Dr. Nedostup focused on politics and religion in modern China and the relationship between modernity and religion in comparative context. And these interests are captured in her 2009 book, Superstitious Regimes, Religion and the Politics of Chinese Modernity. For the book she is currently working on, entitled Living and Dying in the Long War, she explores displacement, home, and community formation during China and Taiwan's mid-20th century long war, the Japan Civil and Cold Wars between roughly 1937 and 1959. The book aims to build an empirical and theoretical foundation explaining one of the most significant, yet poorly understood subjects of the 20th century, the repeated, often traumatic, and socially significant displacement of persons across China and over the Taiwan Strait from the time of Japan's invasion in 1937 through its surrender and the subsequent Chinese Civil War, and continuing through the 1950s and beyond. For today's talk, Displacement and Taiwan's Geographies, Dr. Nedostup will draw in part on material she collected for this book, but also from material she's already considering for the book she's planning after this one is done. She will ask how the history of displacement and the field of critical refugee studies enables a more comprehensive understanding of Taiwan. Let's welcome Dr. Nedostup.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for the extremely kind introduction, for the invitation, and to Brian for all the help for getting me here, for all of you for being here and the dregs of the semester. I know we're all feeling it. So I want to try to keep this an open conversation and present to you some ideas, some of which are more fully cooked than others, and I hope that we can kind of cook the remaining ones together, because I have really been trying to think, propelled by a few different sort of institutional conversations and situations, to think through both where Taiwan sits in different sets of regional histories, but also how to actually grow and help students and other faculty grow Southeast Asian Studies program where there is none. Because we have been thinking about this at Brown too, as Sylvia pointed out. So for the past several years, we've had a student group, the Southeast Asian Studies Initiative, has been at the forefront of this, of really trying to press the administration to hire tenure-track faculty, because we have very few. We now have a couple of tenure-track faculty who specialize in the study of Southeast Asia or Southeast Asia in the Americas and the Pacific. But for a long time, there were none. For a university that claims to have the stature that Brown claims to have, that's an embarrassment. But it is, so in a way, we are not encumbered by the Cold War frameworks that created Southeast Asian Studies as part of area studies to begin with. But from another angle, we are trying to figure out where we can go and fit institutionally. So one of the things that we're doing is we're searching for a historian of Southeast Asia in my department now. And I think one of the things that I have been learning through that search and through the discussions from students is not just creating Southeast Asian studies as an issue of covering something that ought to be covered that is not, but really what are the intellectual frameworks, the research methodologies, the research ethics that Southeast Asian Studies brings forward that can kind of propel intellectual life at the university writ large. So I'm thinking through some of these things in my talk today. I've been able to work through some of these partly because of some time last spring in Leiden, based at the International Institute for Asian Studies, in a Taiwan Studies chair, visiting chairship, and that's sort of the connection through which I end up here today. But it's also at the IAS, which has been thinking for a long time about how to expand the borders of Asian studies, really helped push me ahead along these lines. And then also I would like to credit colleagues of mine in American studies who helped bring in some funding for a Taiwan-related programming several years ago that was oddly based in American studies. But these were for institutional reasons and personal reasons. But it also helped us do things like think through the place of Taiwan in the Pacific, or bring in people who were experts in new migration patterns into Taiwan from Southeast Asia and to Southeast Asia. And so in a way, that kind of institutional weakness allows a little bit of flexibility, intellectual flexibility as well. So my thanks to all of these interlocutors. And as we always say in scholarship, anything that comes out of my talk that is good, I owe to them, but the mistakes are mine completely. So what I wanted to think through is, as Sylvia said, sort of knitting together some things that are coming out of the book on wartime displacement and community formation, but also thinking through some things that I got to work with in teaching about Taiwan, both in Leiden and at Brown. So I managed to teach my first Taiwan-centered class last spring, and having discussions in Leiden, and which are connected to where I want to go next, which is thinking about the relationship between historical consciousness, local activism, and transitional justice. And of course, these are topics that are all very fruitful, current, and active in Southeast Asia as well. So I'm going to present some examples that are tied to Taiwan and have some origin in early 20th century China. But I'm presenting them as examples that I hope that we can draw out some, where there might be some fruitful comparisons as well and connections with Southeast Asian history. And within all this, I will say too that in talking about 20th century history, I'm very conscious of pointing out the influence of, for instance, American empire, but conscious also of the weight of American empire on our scholarly frameworks. I'm similarly conscious of the weight of Sinocentrism in conceiving of the relationship of either China and Taiwan or Taiwan to Southeast Asia. And so I think that this is something that we can kind of note and sort of pick apart fruitfully. So I want to start off with thinking about how in the process of transitional justice, how artists are often at the forefront of that in the sense of thinking about the histories, place-based histories of political terror, trauma, displacement, that is often artists who are the ones to first sort of activate those memories, call them to attention, and then later on working alongside grassroots activists. But then finally there's, later there becomes a state hand in the commemoration of these places that draws on that earlier artistic exploration. And when the state hand emerges, that it often brings with it a attention to legal frameworks. So either the legal or extra-legal framework of times of authoritarianism and terror, and the legal frameworks that are offered by transitional justice periods, and also the idea of present legal repair. But within that, I want to call attention to the sort of gaps that are left by attention to law, the rule of law, the absence of rule of law, which is the great presence of a sort of gray area of legal exception, quasi-legal exception, or what the legal scholar Flores Sapio calls the zone of lawlessness in the 20th century, that actually has the sort of sheen of law, but allows a lot of state action in between. And how that, I'm going to talk about how that particularly affects property relations and displacement during this time period. And then I want to conclude by thinking about the present moment, or the recent moment, in which we have museumification continue, but also we have the continued use, particularly of art projects or artist spaces as ways to rehabilitate spaces of previous state and military power in Taiwan, or sometimes places of terror, and what all this means for continuity of community or a loss of community memory. So that's kind of my framework. So thinking about art and place-based memories, if you're familiar with the current human rights framework in Taiwan, you'll probably know that, be familiar with these institutions. So in 2018, a National Human Rights Museum was established, and the first two places that were established as part of that museum were places of political terror and imprisonment during the Cold War era. So we have, on the one hand, the Jingmei White Terror Memorial Park, which is in the in Taipei City, broader Taipei City, which was a place of interrogation and also imprisonment, and then the famous site of Green Island, an offshore island, which was also a prison during this time. So we have two prison museums and one house museum. This is more recently added. The house of Nylon Janarong, who was an activist in the around the end of the martial law period, who died by suicide in protest against the continued lack of political openness and direct elections. So in these museums, there's, if you look at the materials, there's an emphasis on, of course, remembrance, honoring of victims, voice for victims. And I'll just say as an aside, there's been some very interesting augmented reality and virtual reality projects lately built around some of these sites as well. But they're also place-based sites that you can visit and interact with in a number of ways. So this is happening fairly recently. I would say a precedent for this might be seen in the work of visual and performance artists, either in the Taiwanese diaspora or within Taiwan itself, who played an important role, actually starting still during the martial law period, so some of them during the 70s and 80s, but then some a little bit more recently, in activating or channeling or expressing these kind of place-based memories of political terror. And one that I started thinking, whose work I started thinking with a little bit last spring is Chen Jie-ren. So Chen Jie-ren started off as a performance artist during the martial law period. His most famous piece during that time was Dysfunction Number 3, so in which he assembled a group of people, and you can see they are wearing the sacks that prisoners would have worn, especially prisoners sentenced to death would have worn. And they had it's black and white pictures, so you can see red eye bands. And they went to the central district, this is in Ximending in Taiwan, so like this major entertainment district, marched around, knelt down. So this was at the time still under single party rule in martial law. Made a big splash. Interestingly, after martial law was lifted, Chen Jie-ren stopped making art for about 10 years, and I think this is something that happens to people who are in this kind of political position, like what do you do when things open up? But then later on in the first decade of this century, he turned to video art. Some of you might be familiar with his most famous piece, which is called Ling Chi, in which he reenacts the execution of a prisoner during the late Qing dynasty. But another piece that he made was much more personal. So he had a series called Empire's Borders, which was specifically looking at the place of Taiwan during the Cold War and interacting with American empire. But in this one piece, Western Enterprises, he was talking specifically about the history of his father. So Western Enterprises, Shifang Gongsi, was the cover name for the CIA's presence in Taiwan during the Cold War. And during the, thank you. That's good, great. So in the sort of story of this video series, he has an actor sort of enacting his role of finding, after his father's death, finding this photo album that had on its cover Western Enterprises, Shifang Gongsi, but then it was empty, completely empty. And along with it, father had a list of comrades that were killed in action. And then all he knew found out gradually, was that his father had been part of this anti-communist guerrilla group that had been trained by the CIA to make landings on the Chinese coast during the 50s and 60s, to sort of explore for a potential assault against China. So he's meditating in this video on all these kind of absences, presence, glimpses of records and absences of records, but also thinking about places as well. So in the video, the actor sort of playing him comes across the empty album, the list, and the uniform. And so he puts on the uniform and starts to wander around this abandoned building, which has all this detritus of kind of Cold War era Taiwan around it. And then goes from room to room, and some of the rooms he comes across are sites of political interrogation and torture. And this builds on a slightly earlier work of Chen Jieren's called Military Court and Prison, where he starts to think about these sites that were still not yet museumified, but were still all around Taiwan, and what might have happened in them. And then in some other rooms during the video series, he comes across empty file cabinets, or as here, scattered belongings, scattered files, to kind of represent the impossibility of assembling an archive to actually record the events of people like his father. And as you see in this one, there's a furnace in the middle also for the burning of classified documents. And in some parts of the video, the American connection or Empire connection is made visible. So here is the symbol of the Military Assistant Advisory Group, which was the larger American military presence, technical presence in Taiwan during the Cold War. One of the things that's interesting about the video, too, is that it was filmed in an abandoned chemical plant that was built by the Americans during this period of technical and military assistance. So in a way, it's trying to make a kind of place-based link to all these displacements of memory, displacements of experience, or erasures of experience that have happened during this time period. So I think we can sort of see different kinds of connections, direct links to the museumification that later happens. But there are a number of other places around Taiwan, especially today, which link older military sites and current day artistic practice. The most famous one that probably many of you know is Treasure Hill Artist Village in not too far from National Taiwan University in Taipei, but which started off life as a kind of quasi-legal, I would say very much gray area residence for recently arrived military migrants from the mainland in the 1940s. At that time, it was also kind of like an anti-aircraft installation. So guarded quite heavily, but as that latter part dropped away in the 1970s, many more military-dependent families moved in quasi-legally or illegally in the 1970s, and so it became a much larger community. As those people aged or moved away, then artists moved in, and that's actually a fairly common sort of transition for some of these what we could call squatter communities. And so, but the difference with Treasure Hill is that the artists then organized it officially, made it a place where people could come and do residencies, and so now it is kind of like an international institution. And so that has led to, in an odd way, the preservation of some of the buildings and the preservation of some of that history, but with a completely new purpose and a completely new set of actors inside. So I think that's actually a useful context for rethinking also these this other kind of place-based museums, which are coming in the aftermath, a few years after both the art of people like Chen Jie-ren and then also the art activism of the group that formed Treasure Hill. And so I think there's a heavy artistic presence in these museums, but it's also actually trying to do what the artists first did, which was take these places which are legally liminal spaces in terms of safety and danger, also liminal spaces, and then legitimize them as part of the memorialization process. Another thing that you see, though, in the materials of the human rights museums is, of course, this emphasis on law and legal transition. So I'll just give you some material that actually comes from the Human Rights Museum website. So I find this kind of interesting because you need something on which to hang a narrative. So in a lot of ways, this makes sense. So the narrative is hung on the passage of laws that actually suspend laws, right? So the passage of these temporary provisions effective during this very long name, effective during the period of the Communist Rebellion in 1948, which is essentially suspending a lot of aspects of the Constitution and suspending other laws, and then a number of other following Cold War laws that focus on anti-communism, that focus on espionage, that focus on so-called rebellion. And noting that it was under the auspices of these regulations, which are in fact suspension of the rule of law, temporary suspension under martial law, that meant that people were arrested, interrogated, jailed, executed. And then the obverse of that are these new regulations for recognizing, compensating victims, and noting how many victims have been compensated since 2014. So I think this, it makes, from the point of view of a human rights museum, this is kind of the kind of work you want to do. You want to send that sort of pedagogical message about the importance of legal structures. Well, one of the things I see when I look at actual contestations of space and buildings, and also farm property during this time period, is a very large space of exception that is really shaping what is going on. So I started looking at Flora Sapio's work in this regard, and I found it kind of interesting and useful because she's basically talking about mostly contemporary China, but a little bit PRC history as well. And she's looking at things like Shuanggui and extrajudicial, extralegal detention. But I find in her focus on creating this idea of a vast space of legal exception that is actually enabled by administrative law, I find this to be a really helpful explanatory framework for a great deal of 20th century Chinese history, and then by extension, the history of the Republic of China on Taiwan. So when she says that, that first of all, administrative acts, and then she draws on some of these early observations of Chinese law in the pre-PRC period, in the Republican period, that administrative law is prominent, and then it's also creates this very unsatisfactory relationship between people and the law, because they actually don't know who to respond to. There's not, versus, for instance, very well established procedures in civil law that people were used to dealing with. They're not actually clear on how to protest against or even launch lawsuits against administrative acts and regulations. But there's still, as she points out, there's nonetheless a consciousness that there is this very large area of life that is being increasingly carved out and governed by regulations, statutes, emergency laws, and so on, all these other apparatuses of the administrative state. And so I find her remark that she says the legal exceptions are visible in those spaces in which everyday life is lived. And to be particularly salient, because I see it a lot in terms of property relations, displacement, resettlement, and refugee life overall. So I went back and looked a little bit at the shaping and reshaping of the Republic of China land law, which gets ported over with the nationalist government to Taiwan, but that originates in 1930 in China, and then gets revised immediately after the Second Sino-Japanese War. One of the things that is interesting that emerges from that law is a deep emphasis on what kinds of land is collectively owned, and a carving out of space for collectively owned land to be assumed by the state, whether that's local entities or national entities. And so through each revision of the law, we see the addition of different categories of property that can be claimed by the state, and sometimes they're for environmental reasons, so they're, rivers, waterfalls, and so on, waterways can be claimed. But also, when we get to the 1946 revision, land that has, where landlords have been absentee for a set period of time. And you can imagine, coming out of wartime, how that's actually a very important category, because lots of people are missing, lots of people are not missing but away, and aren't necessarily able to return to their home place to establish control of their land, much less ownership of their land, in a time period that is good enough for the government. So we see the increasing ability of the state to claim lands, and especially in places that are strategically important or ethnically important, or both, as a way of, for state purposes. And sometimes this is for resettling refugees. And I'll explain a little bit more in a second how that works. So the reason why state claims on land become important, or being able to easily establish land as not having an owner or laying fallow, which is another kind of a legal category that gets deployed. And if land is not being cultivated, then it can be assumed by by national or local government entities for the purposes of, for instance, resettling refugees. This is an idea that probably, that has some much earlier precedent in Chinese history, but that becomes really activated as a central state project in the 20th century. We see it originate in the 1920s. Pierre Fuller has written about this as in the form of local projects to resettle displaced persons in northeast China, for instance. So this is the area that eventually, soon thereafter, becomes Manchukuo. So the purpose of resettling refugees is both strategic state building as well as relief-related or humanitarian. In the 1930s, we start to see some local charitable projects that are really interested in, for instance, fostering links between urban intellectuals and who have been displaced by the encroaching Japanese presence, and local farmers or who have also been displaced, as a way of sort of advocating for rural rebuilding, a kind of utopian social projects that in some ways anticipate the projects of Maoist China. But in the 1930s and 40s, as displacement really ramps up, and here we're talking about displacement of close to a quarter of the Chinese population after 1937, we have a number of government-sponsored projects that are meant to settle people in rural areas for the purposes of agricultural production to build up state capacity during wartime. Not all of these people are farmers in origin. Not all of them are able to farm, but in a sense, they are transformed into farmers by the Refugee Resettlement Project. And here's this is, to me, something that is an interesting resonance with Evelyn L'Espiritu Gandhi's recent work on Vietnamese refugees in Israel-Palestine, and thinking of the category of refugee settler. I'm still thinking through the comparisons, and it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but we do have here the idea of the utilization for strategic purposes of refugees to settle places that the government once settled, the state once settled. In her formulation, this is tied to, of course, to American empire, anti-communism, and these broader political efforts. And what I look at, for instance, a lot of the resettlement projects that I have been studying in Sichuan are moving people from central China to places that are ethnically very diverse in southern Sichuan, western Sichuan, or basically majority non-Han people. So there is a project of sort of social stabilization, the expansion of governmental control, but also of shifting the ethnic balance in these places. We could also think of this as picking up on a longer-term process, and one of the speakers we had come to Brown is Ma Vang, and talk about her book, History on the Run. And one of the things she talks about, too, is from the point of view of people who are displaced in 20th century Laos, this is just another stage in a long process of displacement that begins with Chinese migration during this time period. So I'm trying to kind of tease out how these things fit together as well. When we get to the 1940s and 50s, and particularly in Taiwan, but we see some of this in China too, there's the problem of, first of all, reclaiming, who's going to reclaim colonial era property or occupation era property. And the process that we see in Taiwan is of not just the state, but particularly the Nationalist Party, assuming control of Japanese property and then reusing it for the purposes of housing military families, of housing veterans, of housing its own personnel as well. So there's an odd kind of truncated or stop-start decolonizing process going on there. So that's one stage. And then a slightly later stage, as we get into the mid-1950s, is that globally funded projects, resettlement projects, enter the scene, particularly the United States funding resettlement projects around Taiwan of Cold War refugees. So that's a really small map. I know you're not going to see it very well, but this is just to point out that the places I'm looking at in Taiwan are in the sort of western area, so places that have high concentrations of ethnic Tibetans, of Yi, and then some in the south, southern border of Sichuan, which have high concentrations of Miao. There are some other examples that I don't really look at, but some other people have been looking at. Michael Moscalino talks about the environmental effects of resettlement in North China after the bursting of the Yellow River dikes and the resulting depletion of the capacity of the land where refugees are resettled. There's also a large scale, a smaller scale project, which becomes a much larger scale project after the PRC, to resettle veterans and military personnel in the Northwest and in Xinjiang. One thing that happens in the post-war in places in East China is that we start to see a kind of ranking or prioritization of some kinds of displaced people over others. So, for instance, there's quite a few disputes in Zhenjiang city, near the capital of Nanjing, over this sedimentary land on the edges of the Yangtze River, which are traditionally sort of seasonally settled from people from the north of the province. But a lot of those people are kicked out to make way for veterans, pushed by these government programs in the 1940s. So we see a kind of prioritization there. And then the Cold War project in Taiwan, the one that I look at particularly, is the resettlement of people who live on offshore islands near the coast of Zhejiang, being brought to Taiwan in 1955, and then resettled all around the island. For those people who are essentially coming from Dachan and some other islands off of the East China coast, who are brought by US Navy ships. One of the things that, so when I first started looking at this, looking at it a number of different aspects, including housing, US State Department funding, and distribution. This is another very famous instance of people who are mostly very much not farmers being made into farmers. These are mostly people who fish. So there's a real social dislocation on several levels here. But something I've been thinking about more recently are people who are resettled. You see all these villages marked in southern Taiwan, where they run into disputes over land between people, sometimes people of Taiwanese descent, or sometimes Hakka people who have been in these communities for a while. But these are also areas with the largest indigenous populations in Taiwan, Austronesian populations. And so my idea now is actually I want to do a little digging to think about like the longer durée history. Once we push back beyond the 20th century, what is actually going on in terms of a kind of like repeated displacement in these areas, and how can we envision Taiwan history pushing beyond that 20th century framework. I will say one thing about the U.S. State Department involvement. So there's quite a bit of funding going towards like jobs training, skills training, political training, and so on during this time. But the State Department officials who are funding this also say this makes a really good model for what we can do in Malaya or Indochina. So there is this kind of thinking about this sort of broader strategic Hamlet thinking that I think might be like more usefully theorized or compared. So what does this have to do with the law? So there's, as my mentioning of the disputes indicates, there's a lot of legal gray zone in these resettlement areas. And looking at discussions of land use in the Taiwan Provincial Assembly materials, I sort of saw this overview that it goes much further beyond these particular resettlement projects. So that within the course of a couple of decades, we see a lot of questions that are raised about the rights to land, of course, that has been assumed for infrastructure projects, the rights to farmland. Former Japanese property is a big area of dispute, but also a lot of questions about and disputes about mountain land, and particularly with regard to indigenous Taiwanese, and not just their land rights, but how those areas will be governed. And there are many, many questions and complaints in these records about the assumption of this property, sometimes by these resettled Cold War refugees, but sometimes also by military and state enterprises, government entities. And the other thing I'll mention is that sometimes it's not just a question of who gets the right to property or who loses the right to property, but even people who are, for instance, given the, in a kind of lottery system or distribution system, given the right to live in a former Japanese owned house, for instance, are charged a lot of fees and repair costs and so on by the government during this time. So there's this like growing legal infrastructure and administrative infrastructure around the sort of passage of property that proves increasingly burdensome. I would say the majority of these questions are about housing rather than about property for carrying out a business, for example. So that brings me to my last point, which is about how we think about what constitutes kind of formal, informal property, squatting, not squatting, and this process of cultural rehabilitation of these kinds of areas that's been happening recently. So probably the most famous example of the cultural rehabilitation of so-called squatter zone or informal housing is the very, very lovely park in the middle of Taipei, Da'an Forest Park, which before 1992 was this enormous area of informal housing inhabited by families, these military-dependent families who had come over with the nationalists, but also a number of other people, including south to north migrants, economic migrants. So in 1989, the government announced a plan to demolish that area and make it into a park. There was a sort of legal battle that went on for a few years, but eventually 12,000 people were evicted from this area and then resettled and made into this park. But there are a number of other cases like this around Taiwan. So Taipei Artist Village, I already mentioned, as an example of where the population had dwindled, and then the artistic nature of what came in to replace it helps to rehabilitate that, that place as a place of vibrancy and cultural production. There are other even like more individualistic cases. So this famous place in central Taiwan where a military dependence village also emptied out, but there was one guy who was, I don't think he was the only one left, but he was one of the few people who was left, and then he started himself to repaint the village in these crazy colors, and then it became a tourist. You can imagine like the Instagram opportunities in this place, so like it becomes a big tourist site. And then fairly recently, someone went in and started to paint over the murals, and it created a big scandal. But I think that kind of points to the problem of like when this is sort of like individual or small group activism that creates these spaces, and particularly if they become popular and well-traveled, at some point there's the question of like how to manage them or govern them comes up, or are there interests that want to utilize these spaces for other kinds of development? And I think this problem of like painting over, who painted over and what's going to happen to the Rainbow Village is an example of this. Another interesting case in central Taipei is what had been called the Huaguang community. So these are just some photos that I took in 2011. This is an area that immediately abuts what was the Japanese colonial prison of Taipei. And so it also had some remnants of that prison, but mostly remnants of dormitories for the civil servants who were associated with that prison. But then all this adjacent community of informal housing, quasi-illegal housing had grown up. Similarly, including military-dependent families, economic migrant families, and some artists here and there. And I think under President Ma Ying-jeou, there was a plan to make this area into the Wall Street of, or the Roppongi, I think, of Taipei. So this is directly behind the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial. And there was a long series of grassroots protests against this displacement, of which these banners are part of it. So lawsuits back and forth, people asking to stop the eviction. This is a little bit of what the place looked like at that point. So you can see the blue and white roof of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial in the background. But when I was looking through these photos again, it started to get me thinking about like, okay, so what do we mean by informal housing and the life of a community? So, some scholars that have studied this point out that it's not just the housing, of course, not just the buildings, but it is the community life there. So it's things like, this was a heavily, even though it was, you can see that the buildings themselves are unassuming, I guess would be a kind way to put it, like unassuming. But there was like abundant foliage. People had a lot of trees, had a lot of plants around. Here's some even more lovely flowers. This is very like typical of this kind of informal housing where you had like the first, sometimes the first level would have been like part of a government-sanctioned resettlement project, but then people built illegally these second stories later on. More nice, lovely flowers. There was a Lady Lin Shui temple in the middle of the community as well. There was a lot, community, local district, political organizations, and then some remnants of Japanese-era buildings. And a bit of the wall, the original prison wall there. So in the aftermath of this fight, there's an interesting law passed as part of Taiwan's transitional justice project, which has a few aspects to it. One is restoration of property to victims that you saw earlier. Another is trying to identify remains of victims. But then there's a third one, which is actually looking at property. So this committee for the handling of ill-gotten properties by political parties was, and their affiliate organizations was created. And essentially, when they talk about political parties, they're talking about the nationalists. And so this was a number of major cases have been brought before this committee, quite sometimes deeply contested by the Nationalist Party, looking at properties that were actually controlled by the party, but that kind of under the guise of creating national organizations. So if you look at the list, National Women's League, Central Motion Picture Corporation, Broadcasting Corporation of China, these were all things that are ostensibly national, but really had properties that were managed and the proceeds from which went to the Nationalist Party. They've only just started to really get around to properties that were assumed from the colonial period and then possibly sold on or redistributed. So the kind of thing I was talking about in the second section, that's like way in the future, I think, to handle or discuss. But I think it's kind of useful context to think about, thinking about what happened to the Huaguang community, which is, it's now a very lovely outdoor shopping mall, I guess I would call it. This place called Rongjing Gorgeous Time. It has been created with an eye towards historic preservation. So these are some materials from the website of the Property Development Corporation that has restored and built some things anew in this area. So if you see here, they have some very, very nice language about being welcoming, broadly welcoming, but they also talk about the history of the prison itself. They mention the history of this area and the creation of the Huaguang community and this sort of informal housing. So they do good stewardship in that sense, but there is still, I think when you look at what has become a kind of disjuncture or erasure between the people who constituted that community and the kind of activity that created the neighborhood that you saw and what it looks like now. So this is kind of what it looks like now. The Japanese-era buildings are the center of the reconstruction. They've been restored, I would say, like this is like adaptive reuse, we could consider it, because they've been restored and then added to a bit. And there are some very high-end shops in there. And they've kept some of the trees. They have some historical materials, most of which actually come from not a government archive. They're not cited as coming from a government archive, but from the architectural firm that handled the restoration of this place. And then there's still a lot of empty space behind because they haven't quite figured out what to do with like this demolished community. I happened to be there on Lunar New Year in January, and there were a lot of people, including some people in Japanese dress, like taking photos in front of the nice flowering trees. So there's an odd kind of disjuncture in terms of the historical legacy of this place and the current use. So I just want to wrap up by asking, you know, sort of in these projects, which, you know, I've not seen a lot of like commercial areas like this that have these historical materials out in front. So on the one hand, you know, I find this very striking and a lot to admire about it. But on the other, I think, you know, what is actually being preserved here? There's a certain kind of, it's in a way it reinforces an institutional history. It reinforces the history of colonialism. And then that interim history of made community, created community, maybe ad hoc community is the part that's lost. So we see more of the state hand in some ways, even though it's prettified and commercialized. But then I would argue another thing, which is that this is more like a feature than a bug of this sort of gray legal area that I've been talking about. It creates a process by which it's easier to take over a site, to transform it into an area for capitalist consumption or an area for artistic expression, than to have like a very clear-cut legal process determining who has rights to this property and then restoring them. And so it's an advancement, but it's still sort of an interim stage in transitional justice.